Everyone thinks they understand what just happened here. The story, as it was quickly packaged and sold, was simple and comforting. Donald Trump made a threat, met unexpected resistance, and quietly backed down. Case closed, move on. But if that explanation feels a little too neat, a little too convenient, that's because it is. And the reason figures like Mark Carney reacted so sharply isn't just because Trump was wrong or loud or reckless again. It's because the entire he backed down narrative collapses the moment you actually look at who had leverage, who didn't, and what the incentives were behind the scenes. What made Carney's response land wasn't the volume, it was the subtext. He wasn't just rebutting Trump, he was puncturing a media storyline that lets powerful actors off the hook by pretending chaos equals retreat. That storyline has followed Trump for years. He escalates rhetorically, markets wobble, allies panic, and then when the immediate worst case scenario doesn't happen, commentators rush to declare a climb down. But that framing misunderstands how power actually works in modern political economies. Sometimes not detonating the bomb isn't restraint. Sometimes it just means you never had your finger on the trigger to begin with. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand who Mark Carney is in this ecosystem. He's not a partisan flamethrower. He's a central banker by training, a crisis manager by reputation, someone whose entire career has been built on calming systems under stress. When someone like that openly calls out a narrative as false, it's not because of vibes or ideology. It's because he's reading balance sheets, institutional constraints, and feedback loops most political commentary never touches. And what he saw very clearly was that Trump didn't back down. He hit a wall. Trump's political brand has always relied on the appearance of unilateral power. He threatens tariffs, sanctions, exits, punishments, and assumes that the sheer force of will creates outcomes. Sometimes that works in a purely political sense, especially when the other side values stability over confrontation. But it fails badly when the target is a system with its own internal logic and its own red lines. Financial markets, trade networks, and allied governments don't respond to dominance displays the way a rally crowd does. They respond to risk, credibility, and constraints. When Trump made his move here, he wasn't testing the resolve of an individual opponent. He was testing the elasticity of an entire system that simply doesn't bend on command. The media instinctively framed what followed as a retreat because that's how political conflict is usually narrated: threat, standoff, concession. But that framing assumes Trump always has the option to escalate. Carney's intervention was a reminder that this assumption is wrong. In reality, escalation only works if the costs fall primarily on the other side. In this case, they didn't. The costs were immediate, visible, and domestic. Markets reacted, business confidence wobbled, institutions that Trump depends on to function signaled quietly but unmistakably that there was no upside path forward. That's the part almost no one talks about. Trump didn't choose restraint out of wisdom. The system imposed restraint because it had to. And when commentators rushed to call that a back down, they erased the most important lesson. Populist bravado runs into hard limits when it collides with structural power. Carney wasn't just correcting the record for sport. He was warning that misreading this moment sets everyone up for worse decisions later because it teaches the wrong people the wrong lesson. If you believe Trump backed down, you believe next time he might not. If you understand that he couldn't move forward without detonating his own position, you understand why the threat itself was hollow. That distinction matters. It matters for allies trying to decide how seriously to take future ultimatums. It matters for markets trying to price political risk. And it matters for voters who are constantly told that politics is just a series of personal showdowns rather than a web of constraints and incentives. And this is where the deeper story really starts, because the collapse of that narrative didn't happen accidentally. It happened because too many people with real institutional memory recognized the danger of letting myth replace mechanics. Carney's reaction was one of the clearest signals yet that the old habit of translating every Trump episode into a morality play is no longer sufficient. What's at stake now isn't whether Trump looks strong or weak in a given news cycle, but whether the public understands how fragile and interconnected these systems actually are and how easily they can be misread until it's too late. Once you move past the surface drama, the entire episode starts to look less like a political confrontation and more like a stress test that failed before it even began. Trump's threat only had power if the other side believed two things: that he was willing to follow through, and that following through wouldn't seriously damage his own position. Neither assumption held. That's why the reaction from people like Carney was so cutting. They weren't responding emotionally, they were responding analytically to a narrative that inverted reality. This is where the historical context matters, because Trump didn't invent this approach. He inherited it from decades of American political theater where projecting toughness often mattered more than understanding systems. The difference is that earlier presidents, even when they postured publicly, usually had teams quietly mapping out exit ramps. Trump often skips that step. He treats leverage as something you declare rather than something you actually possess. And in this case, the leverage simply wasn't there. Markets figured that out almost instantly. You could see it in the volatility spikes, in the cautious language from major institutions, in the way corporate actors began signaling concern rather than compliance. That's not what backing down looks like. Backing down implies you were winning a standoff and chose mercy or compromise. What happened here was closer to a red light appearing in front of a speeding car. You don't praise the driver for restraint when they slam the brakes to avoid a wall. Carney's background makes him uniquely sensitive to these moments because he's lived through them before. During the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and the early shock of the pandemic, he saw firsthand how quickly confidence can evaporate when leaders misjudge their room to maneuver. He understands that credibility isn't built through volume or repetition. It's built through predictability and respect for institutional limits. When Trump ignored those limits, the system responded by tightening, not yielding. The media, though, often struggles with this kind of story because it lacks obvious villains and heroes. It's much easier to say Trump threatened and then retreated than to explain that the threat itself was never viable. That explanation requires acknowledging that power in modern democracies is diffuse, constrained, and often boring. It also requires admitting that spectacle can mask weakness just as easily as it can project strength. There's also an incentive problem here that rarely gets discussed. Declaring a back down creates closure. It allows pundits to move on, audiences to feel reassured, and institutions to avoid uncomfortable questions about vulnerability. If Trump backed down, the system worked. If Trump was never in control, the system was at risk. One story soothes, the other demands vigilance. Carney chose the uncomfortable one. This matters because Trump's political appeal depends on the illusion that he alone can bend reality. Every time that illusion is punctured, his rhetoric becomes more dangerous, not less. Leaders who mistake resistance for humiliation often escalate recklessly the next time, hoping to reassert dominance. That's why mislabeling structural constraint as personal retreat isn't just inaccurate, it's risky. What Carney was really doing was recentering the conversation on cause and effect. Trump made a move that would have triggered immediate economic self harm. The response wasn't fear or submission, but friction. That friction wasn't ideological, it was mechanical, and mechanics don't care about messaging strategies or ego. They care about inputs and outputs. Understanding that difference changes how you read the entire episode. It stops being about Trump's temperament and starts being about the limits of populist governance in a globally interconnected system. It also raises a more unsettling question. How many times has this happened before quietly without anyone bothering to explain it? How often have dramatic threats dissolved not because of wisdom or compromise, but because reality refused to cooperate? That question hangs over everything that follows because the next phase of this story isn't about Trump at all. It's about what happens when institutions keep absorbing shocks from leaders who don't understand them, and whether those institutions can keep doing that indefinitely without breaking. By the time you get to that question, you start to see why Carney's frustration wasn't performative. It was preventative. He wasn't trying to score points in a political argument. He was trying to stop a dangerous misunderstanding from hardening into conventional wisdom. Because once people internalize the idea that these moments are about personal bravado rather than systemic limits, they start demanding responses that make everything worse. Institutions are very good at absorbing stress quietly until they're not. Central banks, trade frameworks, regulatory bodies, and alliances are designed to dampen volatility, not amplify it. They work best when leaders understand their role and operate within them. The problem with Trump's style is that it treats those guardrails as obstacles rather than stabilizers. When he runs headfirst into them, the collision gets misinterpreted as a tactical retreat instead of what it really is, a warning signal. There's a long pattern here that's easy to miss if you focus only on headlines. Over and over, Trump has announced policies that were either unworkable, legally constrained, or economically self defeating. Over and over, the system has slowed, diluted, or blocked those moves. And over, the aftermath has been narrated as Trump changing his mind. That narrative protects everyone from having to say the obvious out loud. The presidency is powerful, but it is not omnipotent, and pretending otherwise trains leaders to make increasingly reckless bets. Carney understands something else too that rarely makes it into cable news discussions. Systems don't just respond to actions, they respond to expectations. When Trump signals unpredictability, markets price in risk. When allies hear threats, they hedge. When institutions sense disregard for constraints, they quietly prepare for containment. None of that shows up as a dramatic confrontation, but all of it reduces the effectiveness of future threats. Power erodes not in explosions, but in leaks. That's why calling this episode a back down is so corrosive. It implies Trump had options he chose not to use. In reality, his options were narrowing in real time. The moment he made the threat, the consequences began stacking up against him. Carney saw that clearly because his entire career has been about watching those stacks form before they collapse. He knows that when leaders misread these signals, they tend to double down on symbolism instead of recalibrating strategy. There's also a media feedback loop at work here that benefits Trump in the short term but destabilizes everything else. Declaring victory or retreat keeps the story personal and dramatic. It avoids the more uncomfortable truth that modern governance is constrained by forces no single leader controls. That truth doesn't fit neatly into partisan narratives, so it gets sidelined. But sidelining it doesn't make it go away. It just makes the next confrontation more dangerous. Polling consistently shows that large portions of the public believe presidents have far more control over economic outcomes than they actually do. That belief fuels both unrealistic expectations and misplaced blame. When leaders exploit that misunderstanding, they may gain political loyalty, but they also inherit impossible promises. Trump's approach thrives on that gap between perception and reality. Carney's intervention narrowed it, even briefly, and that's why it felt so jarring. What's quietly alarming is how thin the margin has become. The system held this time, but not because it was designed to endure constant stress from bad faith brinkmanship. It held because enough people inside it recognized the danger early and applied pressure in subtle ways. That kind of resilience isn't infinite. Every mischaracterized episode chips away at it, making future shocks harder to absorb. By reframing the moment, Carney wasn't just talking about Trump. He was talking about the conditions that allow leaders like Trump to misinterpret resistance as insult and constraint as challenge. And that reframing forces a harder question. If this wasn't a back down, if it was a boundary, what happens the next time someone decides to test it even harder, convinced the only problem last time was optics? That question is where the conversation stops being theoretical and starts getting uncomfortable, because history is full of moments where leaders misread limits as temporary inconveniences rather than structural facts. When that happens, the next move is almost always more aggressive, not less. If you convince yourself you lost because you weren't loud enough, you come back louder. If you convince yourself you lost because you hesitated, you remove hesitation. That's the danger embedded in the back down narrative, and it's why Carney was so intent on killing it before it settled in. There's a reason experienced economic policymakers tend to sound almost allergic to bravado. They've seen how quickly confidence can flip into panic. In this case, Trump's threat brushed up against a set of deeply interlinked systems: trade relationships, currency stability, investor confidence, and allied political trust. None of those respond well to improvisation. They respond to signals of continuity. When those signals vanish, the reaction isn't confrontation, it's withdrawal. Capital pauses, partners stall, risk premiums rise. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. Underneath, everything is tightening. That tightening is what actually forced the outcome here. Not Trump's restraint, not a clever negotiation, but a collective refusal by the system to play along. And that's the part the media struggles to dramatize. There's no villain monologue when investors quietly shift positions. There's no cinematic showdown when institutions issue cautious statements instead of ultimatums. But those moments are where real power asserts itself, not through force, but through refusal. Carney has spent years warning about the fragility of global economic coordination, especially in an era where political incentives reward disruption. His criticism of Trump wasn't personal, it was diagnostic. He was pointing at a symptom of a larger disease: the growing gap between political storytelling and operational reality. When leaders act as if threats alone create outcomes, they reveal a misunderstanding that markets and institutions will always exploit, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. What makes this moment different from earlier Trump episodes is that the margin for error is thinner now. Global systems are carrying more debt, less slack, and more geopolitical tension than they did a decade ago. Supply chains are more brittle, alliances are more transactional. Trust is harder to rebuild once broken. In that environment, even performative threats have real costs. Carney knows that, and he knows that letting people believe this was a simple retreat understates the risk everyone just ran. There's also an international audience watching these moments closely. Allies don't need Trump to back down, they need predictability. When unpredictability becomes the norm, they start designing workarounds. That weakens influence in ways that don't show up in approval ratings or news cycles. It shows up later when cooperation fails silently. Calling this episode a backdown reassures domestic audiences while signaling nothing useful to partners who are already adjusting their expectations downward. The uncomfortable truth is that Trump's power here was always more performative than practical. His threat relied on others, valuing short-term calm over long-term stability. When that calculation flipped, the threat evaporated. Carney's response made that explicit, and in doing so, challenged a comforting illusion that there is always a strong hand guiding these moments. Often there isn't. Often there's just a system trying to protect itself from the consequences of bad incentives. By now, the pattern should be clear. This wasn't an isolated misinterpretation. It was the product of years of simplifying complex power dynamics into personality-driven narratives. And as long as those narratives dominate, the lessons people take away will be backwards. They'll expect louder threats, bigger gestures, and sharper escalations, convinced that last time failed because it wasn't extreme enough. That's how boundaries get tested until they break, which brings everything to a final, unavoidable point. If this episode wasn't a backdown, but a warning, what does it say about the next confrontation when the warning is ignored? Before I continue with the final section, quick check-in. When you say one part, again, I'll write part 5 and close the full 25,000 plus character script cleanly, following the same rules and letting the conclusion emerge rather than announcing it. That's the question Carney was really asking, even if he never phrased it that way, because once you strip away the theater, what's left is a system that narrowly avoided damage, not through foresight, but through resistance. And resistance only works when it's recognized for what it is. If it gets mislabeled as weakness or retreat, the lesson learned by the person applying pressure is exactly the wrong one. Trump's political instincts have always pushed him toward escalation when he senses limits. He interprets friction as defiance, not feedback. That mindset is manageable when institutions are strong, coordinated, and willing to absorb shock. It becomes far more dangerous when those institutions are stretched thin and public understanding of their role is shallow. The risk isn't that Trump will suddenly discover restraint. The risk is that he'll decide the only mistake last time was not going far enough. Carney's bluntness was a signal to everyone paying attention that the guardrails are real, but they are not indestructible. Markets can refuse, allies can hedge, institutions can slow walk and constrain. But all of that depends on a shared understanding of how power actually functions. When media narratives collapse those dynamics into personality stories, they erode that understanding. They turn structural limits into episodic drama and teach audiences to expect resolution through individual choice rather than systemic pressure. What's unsettling is how familiar this pattern is. Overconfidence meets complexity, threats meet constraints, reality pushes back. And instead of recalibrating expectations, the story gets rewritten to preserve the myth of control. That myth is comforting, especially in chaotic times, but it's also corrosive. It encourages leaders to perform dominance rather than build credibility. It encourages voters to judge strength by volume instead of outcomes. And it encourages institutions to keep doing quiet damage control without public acknowledgement. Carney's intervention briefly interrupted that cycle. By refusing to play along with the back down narrative, he forced attention onto the mechanics everyone prefers to ignore. He reminded people that power in modern politics is conditional, relational, and often invisible. And he implicitly warned that pretending otherwise makes the next crisis harder to manage, not easier. The deeper truth is that this episode didn't end in resolution. It ended in suspension. The forces that constrain Trump are still there, but so are the incentives that produced the threat in the first place. Nothing fundamental was settled. The only thing that changed was whether people noticed the boundary when it appeared. That's why this moment matters more than it seemed at the time. Not because Trump lost or won, but because the system revealed its limits in plain sight. Whether those limits hold depends less on who occupies office and more on whether the public, the media, and political elites are willing to describe reality accurately, even when it's messy and unsatisfying. If this was framed honestly, it would force harder conversations about leadership, responsibility, and the true sources of stability. It would make clear that governing isn't about how aggressively you threaten, but how well you understand the terrain you're standing on. Carney understands that terrain. Trump often doesn't. And the danger lies not in that mismatch alone, but in a culture that keeps pretending it isn't there. Everyone thinks they understand what happened here. Almost no one does. And until that changes, moments like this won't be warnings, they'll be rehearsals.